So good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our first ever live social media event hosted by the U.S.-Japan Council. I'm Fred Katayama. I'm a board member at the Council. I also chair its Communications Committee. And I want to extend a warm welcome to Janice Nimura. She is a wonderful author. She's an editor. She's a writer. She just put out this elegant book called Daughters of the Samurai. You see that title on the cover page there. And she's a native of New York. I'm here based in New York as well. She's married. She got married to her Japanese classmate at Yale, where she studied English, and she became a Japanophile, studied, got a degree in East Asian Studies for a master's at Columbia. And I want to welcome Janice. And Daughters of the Samurai, it has gotten 5-star reviews. I looked at Amazon.com today, Janice. On average, 5 stars. That's amazing. It is now ranked in sales #1 in history books about Asia, #2 in history books on Japan, and #10 on history books on women overall. So, omedetou. Now, before we begin, thank you. And I asked Janice to join us because, one, I happen to be a big fan of Umeko Tsuda, one of the protagonists of this book, from the time I was a kid. I'm not going to explain why, but I heard her name from the time I was growing up in California. But #2, and more importantly, it's because many of the themes in her book are key themes that we at the U.S.-Japan Council tackle from time to time. They're part of our official program, whether you hear us at lectures or at annual conferences. I'm talking about women, leadership, entrepreneurship, education, networking, taking risks, and of course, U.S.-Japan relations. And for all this talk that we hear nowadays about womenomics, as part of Abenomics and Prime Minister Abe's program, I'll go on a limb and say in a weird focused way, I see this theme of womenomics dating back to the Meiji era through Janice's book. And you'll understand why if you read it, and understand more when you hear her speak. And just think about this. We're going back to the 1980s. That's when the Meiji era started, 1868. But in 1871, the government chooses 5 girls, and I say girls because the youngest of them was only 6. That's Umeko Tsuda Umeko. And what amazes me is not only that they went there and stayed for 10 years to study and live and study, but what they did with their lives when they came back. We're going to hear more about that from Janice. And also the fact that they engaged big leaders, including the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, Hirobumi Ito, the first Prime Minister, and members of the Imperial Court. And so it's a fascinating story. Now, I'm going to start the first half by asking questions. In the second half, we'll entertain your questions. You can unmute yourselves when you ask a question. And if you care to tweet, you see the handles. Janice on Twitter is at Janice Nimura. I am, as you can see in the font, Freddy the Cat. And our hashtag at the U.S.-Japan Council is USJC. And so I want to say welcome, Janice, and thanks for joining us. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a new format for me. I'm excited to try a new way of engaging with the group.
Okay, great. Well, believe me, our members will engage you later with questions. But let's start with you first. Now, you speak, you read Japanese. What first sparked your interest in Japan? How did you get into this? You were an English major at Yale.
I was an English major, but I had a Japanese boyfriend, and a couple of years after graduation, we married and moved to Tokyo, where his whole family was. When we came back from Tokyo after 3 years, and I was contemplating graduate school, and I was at that point already a writer, in some form, a rather wise woman of my acquaintance said, "Don't go to graduate school in writing. Go to graduate school in what you write about." In other words, don't study storytelling, go and find some stories to tell. So that's what sent me to Columbia to study Japanese history and fall into a fascination with the Meiji era, which is one of the strangest cultural moments I've encountered in any historical context.
It happens to be my favorite historical period in Japan. It's so fascinating. It's funny when you mentioned you got into Japan because was then your boyfriend. The U.S.-Japan Council prides itself on being a people-to-people organization. Now, what then led you to the story of these 3 women? Well, 5 women, 5 girls, but actually 3, and you can explain why later. But why? How did you stumble upon this story to begin with?
Well, if you don't mind me changing slides here. If I can change slides here, let's see. There we go. My portal to this story was this woman, Alice Mabel Bacon. When I was finished with my master's degree, I enjoyed reading some of the accounts of the Meiji era written by non-Japanese travelers there as the country began to open itself. I'll show you. Travelers who encountered the newly opened ports, no matter how short their stay, came back and wrote a book. And in New York, there's a wonderful old library called the New York Society Library, and in the sub-basement are the Japan travel books, which are fairly goofy in content, many of them. As you can see, some of these, they have titles like In Bamboo Lands and Behind the Screens. And then I found the small green one toward the right there called A Japanese Interior, which was written by Alice Bacon, who was a Connecticut school teacher. And she wrote about traveling to Tokyo in 1888 to teach at an all-girls school in Tokyo, which in itself was striking. And then she mentioned in her preface that she lived not among foreigners, but among Japanese friends, quote-unquote, known long and intimately in America. And for a woman from New Haven in 1888, this made no sense at all. I needed to figure out what prompted this comment. And as I followed where she led, I discovered that when she was 14 years old, her father, the Reverend Leonard Bacon, had taken in a 12-year-old Japanese girl and raised her as part of their family for 10 years. She was Alice's foster sister. She turned out to be the eldest of the trio that I eventually wrote about. So I had found the larger story, and it turned out to be a perfect lens through which to see and understand the Meiji era.
That oldest woman is that Stematsu?
That's right.
Yamakawa? All right. It was one of the central figures in your book. Now, let's fast forward. Now, after the surprise arrival of Commodore Perry on Japanese shores, blowing open this country that had been sealed, hermetically sealed for more than 2 centuries in isolation, Japan decided, wow, we've got to catch up with the black ships. You mentioned this history in your book.
Right.
And the race to modernize. And in that race to modernize, they had this big international diplomatic mission called the Iwakura Mission. I think you've got a photograph of that mission there, right? The visionaries who tried to plot where Japan would go. There you have them, in suits, and also the central guy in the kimono. And they decided that in they would send 5 girls in 1871. 3 of whom wind up staying there, and show us a picture of those 3 girls, including Stematsu, the one that I guess you first encountered in Alice's book.
Well, these were the initial 5. Initially there were 5. The 2 on the ends there were both 14, and it turned out that they, in some ways, had sort of passed the age where they could commit to spending 10 years and changing the core of their beings in a way. The younger 3, Ume the center trio here, Ume on the right, who was 6 in this photo, the other 2 were 10 and 11, stayed the course. Here they are, in their Western clothes.
The one on the far left is Ume.
That's
Stematsu, Ume Kotsuda. The one in the middle is Stematsu Yamakawa, right?
That's right.
And the
right. She was Alice's foster sister.
Right. And then Shige Nagai on the right. Now, tell us about these 3. How do they get chosen? And there is that part of your book of the daughters of the samurai. What is the significance of them being samurai, daughters of samurai?
Right. So, these were 3 girls from 3 different families. All samurai families because they were being recruited from the educated class. But they, even though they came from different families, their families had a significant amount in common. This 1871, this is 3 years after a brief and bloody civil war that ousted the shogun, ended the shogunate, and replaced it with the young Meiji emperor. All 3 of these girls' families had been on the losing side. They had all backed the shogun, and they had lost. And with that loss came the loss of their rank, their prestige, their reputations. And for different reasons, all of these families also had an unusually acute understanding that Western ideas were going to be where the future was headed. And they had other children, including sons. So it was conceivable in their minds to risk a daughter, understanding that if their gamble paid off, she might return with skills that would restore some of the prestige they had lost in the Civil War.
And what were the major oligarchs, the government officials, what was their thinking? What do they want to see by investing in these 5 to send them off for 10 years?
Right.
What were they hoping to get back?
Right. Well, one of the Meiji oligarchs, not one of the ones who accompanied them on the Iwakura mission, but a different one, had traveled previously in America, and he had noticed that American women were not like women in Japan, that they were well-read, that they had opinions, that they shared their opinions with their husbands and brothers and sons and fathers, and that these men listened to them. And he started to wonder, maybe the success of America is partly due to the way its men are supported by their women, and that maybe the same could be true in Japan, that educated women could support men spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, and really help Japan rise. I think the quote at the time was, if you send girls, that it'll be as a little leaven leavens the whole lump. They were going to be sort of like yeast, and through their example, Japan would rise like bread.
Wow. Well, what's amazing is they're put on the ship with a bunch of other men. They left the shores of Japan with no knowledge of English.
None.
And yet, when they returned, they couldn't read or write Japanese. Umeko, the youngest of the bunch, couldn't even speak Japanese. Yet they're full of new Western ideas and ideals. And at the time, when they return, what's more, the problem is Japan has gone through a reactionary period, right? At first they said embrace the West. Now they're saying, hey, maybe we've gone a bit too far. So tell us about each of these girls. Give us their names. Tell us, what do they face, and what do they do when they came back? Tell us about it.
Well, let's start with the one who had the easiest time, the middle one, Shige, the guy on the right in this picture. She had the easiest time because she had met and fallen in love with a fellow Japanese foreign student, a young man who had studied at Annapolis at the Naval Academy. And so when she went back to Japan, she went with the excitement of someone who was about to be married. She also had studied music while she was here. She had gone to Vassar, but not for a bachelor's degree, for a music certificate. So she had studied piano. And she had retained some of her Japanese because she and Sematsu had both grown up in New Haven and then both gone on to Vassar. So they had always been able to converse with each other some. When she got back to Tokyo, which was eager to learn from her Western music skills. You know, if you're going to entertain foreign dignitaries, you have to be able to have a ball. And she had those skills to share. You don't need to be able to read and write in order to teach music. So her skills fit fairly well with her return to Japan. She settled down and had a very happy marriage, 7 children, and never stopped teaching music in school.
That's a far cry from today's Japan with less than 2 children per household.
Stark contrast. Her friend and soulmate Sematsu, who she had walked next to all these years in America, had a much harder time. She had been a dazzling success at Vassar. She had done the full 4-year baccalaureate degree, a BA. She was the first Japanese woman ever to earn a college degree anywhere, and she was dazzling on campus. She completely transcended her Japanese exotic background. She was the president of the sophomore class. She was invited to join the Shakespeare Society, and she was a graduation speaker. She was covered in the newspapers. When she returned to Japan, illiterate and with big ambitions, to found a school, and she said she wanted to be part of the noble army of spinsters and really make change. Her illiteracy, she suddenly realized, was going to hold her back. And she, in some ways, is the most poignant figure because what she decided to do, in the end, was marry a very, very powerful man, Iwao Oyama, who was the Minister of War, a generation older than she, with children of his own, a widower. And in his circles, she might be able to become a patron of education and women's philanthropy. And that's what she did. She never taught again. She never left Japan. She really operated behind the scenes.
And it was a really difficult decision for her, right? I mean, the letters that she wrote back and forth, she and Alice, she was really squirming. I want to do this, but on the other hand, there's this other calling. Should I get married? Am I throwing away my ideals, everything that I'd aspired for? And in the end, she wound up marrying this individual.
Right. I think she had been other her entire childhood in America. She was, for the most part, the only Japanese girl around. Coming back to Tokyo, she realized that if she decided to remain single, she was going to be other for the rest of her life, because women in Japan, at her social level, didn't decide to remain single. There was no term for that. There was no model for that. And she realized that if she joined herself to Oyama, she would have a place in society from which to operate, and without the loneliness that she was all too familiar with, even though she had been so successful in America.
And we can show a picture of her later, I guess, of her in that sort of Parisian outfit. I don't know if it's the next one up or down the way, but it was a stunning picture to see what she became.
Yeah, right.
And that's there's a picture you can tell talk about high society.
Mm.
And so that's Stematsu, and she winds up also being a patron of education. And let's go back now to the youngest of the bunch, the most famous of the bunch, and anyone studying in Japan knows the name of Ume Tsuda, who went on to found Tsuda College. But she was the youngest at the time, well-bred in Washington, Georgetown circles of that. Tell us what she went through when she came back.
Right. This is a picture of her at about 18, right about the time that she went back to Tokyo. She grew up as sort of the pampered only child of an older, childless Georgetown society couple. They called her their sunbeam from the land of the rising sun. And she also was dazzling in school, became the darling of their social set. Every time she won a prize or did a recitation, the newspapers covered it. And she lost every word of her Japanese. So that when she returned, she returned the most Americanized of the three. She really had almost an American missionary mind in her Japanese self.
In fact, she became a Christian, right, if I remember correctly.
She became a devout Christian and really, had come to see through the lenses of an American girl, an upper middle class, intellectual, rather pious Christian girl. When she got back to Tokyo, partly because of her inability to speak Japanese, she adamantly refused to consider marriage to anyone for any reason ever. She also, was horrified that Japanese men drank on Sundays. She was coming from a place that was much too far away to consider uniting with one. And she did settle down to teach the newly founded Puresses School, which was a school founded to educate the daughters of the aristocrats. And she toiled, came to regret that she had come back to Tokyo at 18, having not yet done any college education, and so she went back to America and studied at Bryn Mawr. When she was finished.
And tell us what she studied, because it wasn't typical small little English or whatever.
No, she
wanted to challenge herself.
Yeah, she wanted to challenge herself. I think she wanted to set herself apart a bit from the older members of her trio. And I think she wanted to put herself on a par with many of the young men who had come to America to study in various universities. So she studied biology, I think sort of to prove that she could, and ended up publishing a paper in a journal with her professor. She was
actually, Bryn Mawr wanted to keep her, right?
Yes, that's right. She was offered a position as a laboratory assistant. And Martha Carey Thomas, who was the head of Bryn Mawr and a rather formidable figure, was, by some accounts, never quite forgave her for turning that offer down and returning to Japan after all. But again, this is where that samurai piece comes in again. None of these three girls, for none of them did it ever cross their mind to say, I think I'd rather just stay in America. They had grown up with samurai discipline. And when they left Japan, they had been given a mandate by the Empress to go and do this and come back and help. And they were going to do that. It never crossed their minds not to.
And in Stematsu's case and Ume's case, it was clear they said they wanted to found a school. And Stematsu gets married. Uma says, I will never get married. I'm always going to stay single, and don't pair me up with anybody, even though people keep trying to pair her up with folks.
That's right.
And she goes out, raises money. Tell us about the networking. I mean, she was networking at high levels in America. And she also took a risk because of throwing away her family's pedigree, and also the nobility title, whatever she had. Tell us about that, how her I guess, penchant for risk.
Yeah, I mean, when she was at Bryn Mawr, she cultivated a circle of wealthy Philadelphia matrons who also had, you know, sort of a missionary impulse, although they weren't about to up stakes and leave for, you know, benighted unchristian nations. But they saw her as a great way to do this kind of work without leaving home. And she definitely worked that circle so that when she came back from Bryn Mawr, she already was able to found a scholarship that sent another Japanese girl to Bryn Mawr each year after she returned. Then she stunned everyone by leaving her government teaching jobs and the official bureaucratic rank that went with them, of which she was very proud, to found a school. Whoops, sorry. One moment. Let's see. Sorry about that. To found a school which was going to be different than the pure rest of the school. This was not going to be a finishing school for polishing the daughters of the elite. This was going to be a school for preparing young women of some intellectual talent to pass the certificate to be English teachers. So when she was back from Bryn Mawr, this is now around 1901, she quit all of her jobs and founded what was called Joshi Eigakujuku, which is loosely translated as the Women's Home School of English. You can see, if you look in the back row to the right, a tall Caucasian woman, that's Alice, who came back to help her teach in this newly founded school. That's the whole school at its inception. In a little
the fact that Alice is now close to Umiko is interesting because she started out as Stematsu's friend up in New Haven in Yale land, territory of Vassar, and winds up being a comrade of Umiko. In other words, these three, they were a trio, weren't they? They were always, they networked with each other, they celebrated their joys, talked about their sorrows.
Right. Right. I mean, the term that I came to use in the book was they were really a country of three. There was no one on earth who understood where they had been and what they had done. There was no one in Japan who had done what they had done. There was no one in America who looked like them. There was no one else but the three of them, and Alice to a certain extent, because she had grown up with them. But they offered each other a kind of support that it's hard to underestimate. You know, Umetsuda's story is very well known in Japan, but it's not usually told as in the context of these two other or three other people that supported her so strongly.
Now, with Ume, she goes on, even raises money from the Rockefellers, the Carnegie Foundations, if I remember correctly. And she definitely had this sense of risk-taking, of networking, and at the same time, I guess a sense of pride. I mean, she could have stayed in the U.S. She did go back to Japan twice. Tell us about, you know, there are a lot of Japanese students who come to study in the U.S. because their parents are stationed here, the Kikokushijo, they return and they find that they don't fit with the culture. Is there anything that we can take away, people can learn, whether it's inspirational tales or how they overcame this, being a fish out of water, and succeeded the way they did?
Yeah, well, I think in Ume's case, what she did was not try to fit in. She went in exactly the opposite direction. She knew herself well enough to know that she was never truly going to be able to slide back into Japanese society at a level that would be satisfying to her. So she turned around at 180 degrees and went marching in the opposite direction. I'm going to stay single. I'm going to found a school. I'm going to, at the point where she founded the school, in Japan, each family has a koseki tohon, a family register, which is a piece of paper that lists, all of the members of the family. And when you get married, you take yourself off of your father's registry and you put yourself on your husband's registry. She took herself off of her father's registry and started her own, on which she listed herself rather proudly as shizoku, as samurai. She I think, had a very clear sense that the only way she was going to be able to survive this double uprooting was to stay true to herself and not necessarily care too deeply how she was seen. Although, on another level, she did care deeply how she was seen. So she's a fascinating figure. All of these three are fascinating in just insofar as they were never truly comfortable anywhere for the rest of their lives.
And Shige Nagai, the one who probably is the least prominent of the three, she had 7 kids, as you mentioned, and yet she was working all through that time as a teacher. I guess is an early example of the work-life balance.
Right. Here she is. Sorry, I'm flipping through all those slides. Here's Shige at her Vassar graduation. She, I think, what made things a little bit easier for her is that she didn't have quite the degree of ambition that the other two shared. She was never as aggressively ambitious or dazzling as the other two, and she served really, I came to think of her as sort of their den mother. She was the one that they came back to when they struggled. She was the one that worried over them. The letters that I was able to find of Shige's were always letters of concern about the other two. She was very selfless and very generous. As a teacher as well, she was beloved by her students. So she's an example of someone who took sort of a more homely route, a less prominent route, but was no less important to the success of the other two.
And I guess, having read this book, you have a soft spot for Stematsu. The sense I got at how intellectual she was, at the struggles that she went through in deciding what she'll do with her life, and given the station that she decided, I'm going to make the best of this thing. I'm going to be a patron of education. I'm going to help out other people. The Charity Bazaar, for example, tell us about that, what she did, what she organized, and what she pioneered.
Right. I mean, growing up in New Haven, she was the foster daughter of a very prominent Congregational minister, Leonard Bacon, who was part of New Haven society. He was a professor at Yale Divinity School, and he was very much part of the leading thinkers of New Haven. And in that level of society, she went to a lot of church bazaars and women's circles where women were rolling bandages or making clothes for refugees. And she learned this idea that women in their own domestic way can help other people far from their own circles. So that when she got back to Japan, she brought this idea with her. And one of the first charity hospitals in Tokyo became her project. She organized the first charity bazaar and encouraged all of the wives of the Meiji statesmen to contribute their own handicrafts, which was staggeringly odd as far as they were all concerned. These were women who were rarely seen in public, never touched money. The idea of making something and selling it with their own hands, because this bazaar was staffed by these women, was revolutionary. And there's some very funny newspaper accounts, actually, of when this bazaar took place, because apparently, for the first couple of hours, everybody was very understated and demure and rather restrained. And then they sort of got into it, and by the end of it, were haggling and trying to coax change out of their husbands' pockets, like any bunch of Americans at a charity bazaar. So
amazing for anyone who studied Japanese history, knowing that just a few years before, it was feudal Japan in the Tokugawa era, where under the code of the way of the war and under Bushido and the feudalism, the merchants were at the very bottom rung of society because of money, and the samurai were at the top. And to see, I guess, the scene where these samurai elite women were now haggling and carrying out this bazaar was also amazing. My favorite picture, I think, comes at the end where you see the three reunited with Alice Bacon, all well-dressed. You get the sense they're these refined, elegant women of society. I guess before she was to go back to the U.S. Tell us finally, you were an outsider when you went to Japan. Did you identify with these women in any way? And are there any lessons that you think that we as Americans, as Japanese Americans, or people who are interested in Japan can learn from them when it comes to things such as leadership or networking or entrepreneurship. And in this context, that the lens is different back then, expectations and society versus what can be expected of women today.
Right. Well, that's a lot of questions all in one, so you're going to have to remind me of them as I go. But, you know, my portal to this story was Alice Bacon, and she remained a real guide. At first, I thought I was going to write a book about Alice because she sounded like people I knew. I grew up at an all-girls school with the same kind of blue stocking attitudes that these women really represented. And she, even though her voice was 140 years old, it sounded like one of my teachers. She was very wry and dry, but straight shooting, very open-minded, but very critical in a not in a negative way, but in a rather acute way. The book that she wrote about the year that she taught a Japanese interior, she finishes by saying something along the lines of, I don't know what civilization means as well as I thought I did when I came after this year in Tokyo. So that kind of, I am going to think about what I'm seeing. I'm going to compare it to what I know. I'm going to keep my mind open. I'm going to try to bring the things that are good from my background to this new context and be open to the things in this new context that are worth bringing home. That all resonated with me. You know, I moved to Tokyo when I was 24 as a newlywed to move in with my husband's family. And I was extremely eager to fit in. I had almost no skills with which to do so. And I knew exactly how she felt and also how the girls felt when they returned to Tokyo with little language skills. That urgency of wanting to fit in, but also that chafing of I don't think I see things the way everyone around me is seeing them. Those were powerful resonances that made telling this story very personal, even though you might not think from looking at me that I had much to bring to this story. Let's see, the themes you were getting at. There is a lot of making lemonade in this story. You know, wherever they found themselves, these girls who were chosen basically at random had the grit and the intellectual capability and the charm to make the most of every context they found themselves in, sometimes in ways that they hadn't predicted. Sematsu's decision to marry Oyama was very much in a direction that she had never anticipated. And as you mentioned, the letters that she wrote home to Alice at that point were anguished. She was turning everything she thought about who she was on its head. But she made a tremendous success of that decision. She ended up Princess Oyama, quite renowned. Let's see. A lesson from each of them? I think we've touched on some of...
Well, we've gotten a lot out of, I guess, with
right.
Networking and risk-taking and entrepreneurship in education.
Mm-hmm.
But was there anything on the networking end? For example, with Sematsu in high society, and these folks had access to people like the Prime Minister who gave them an audience, or that surprised me too.
Right. Well,
open-minded was on the leadership, on some of the leaders at least.
Well, Hirobumi Ito plays a significant role in this story. He was on the Iwakura mission, so he was on the boat over to America with the little girls. He took a special interest in them. He was a little more solicitous than some of his colleagues who didn't seem to notice that the girls were there. And all along the way, even after they returned, he hired Ume to be a tutor for his children. Then he solicited Sematsu's advice on starting the Peeresses School with information that she brought with her from Vassar. And he continued to be a patron of their efforts. They were able to, and these were men who were not in the habit of working with women on a professional level. They managed to walk that line. An important thing to remember about these women, I think it's very easy to see them as sort of, feminists or something. Their goal in promoting women's education was not to create female leaders. It was to demonstrate to men that educated women were worth having around. To change the attitude of men toward educating women by being lovely, graceful, rather demure, educated women. It was a very, I think from the point of view of today, it would seem very strategic. I don't think they were necessarily being strategic. They were being true to themselves. But
as a consequence, I guess, for example, in Ume's school, she wound up educating a lot of future leaders. I think one of them at the U.S.-Japan Council annual conference 2 years ago, the presidency of Dena, I believe she was a Tsuda college graduate.
Absolutely.
Certainly a lot of big ones came out, yeah.
Definitely. I mean, but part of the paradox is that when generations of alums started to come out of Tsuda College, and some of them started to be activists, this is within Ume's lifetime, she wasn't all that happy with their stances. I mean, Hiratsuka Raicho, who started the magazine Seito, which translates as blue stocking, she was someone who really agitated for women's rights. Ume described her as an agent of the devil. She was not comfortable with women making noise. Because she was at the beginning. I think, she knew she was starting something, and it needed time to sort of, it was going to take a long time for women, the women that we think of now as Tsuda's strongest graduates, to be accepted in Japanese society, and Ume probably wouldn't recognize some of them today, but there's a continuum that you can trace from one to the other.
Okay, and now it's time to turn to the audience for questions. Please unmute yourselves when you want to ask a question, and please identify yourselves, your name, and your affiliation. So we'll open up the lines and your question for Janice Nimura.
Hi, this is Atsuko Jenks. I am a U.S.-Japan Council member, and I'm also a graduate of Tsuda College.
Oh, wonderful. You have something to bring here.
Program, and in fact, I was in Japan last week for annual meeting of Alumni Association chapter presidents. I'm a San Francisco chapter president of Tsuda College Alumni Association. So at the meeting, we talked a lot about your book.
Oh, wonderful. I'm glad to hear it.
We also circulated your Japan Times review, book review, which was so insightful and fabulous. And I have not read your book yet, but I will. And so we are all very excited about your book. And I'm sure some professors will probably consider using your book in lectures at Tsuda College. And a very good friend of mine who is also a professor of English at Tsuda College, she did a lot of study about Ume Tsuda's upbringing and history and whatnot. So I'm just so excited for this whole thing. I just wanted to mention what Fred said at the beginning. This story is an old story, and all Tsuda College graduates know. However, it is so fresh now in terms of women's leadership, entrepreneurship, taking risks. And here in San Francisco, in the middle of Silicon Valley, I deal with that every day with Japanese business people. And the fresh look at this Ume Tsuda's courage and her dedication to women's education was incredibly relevant to the current entrepreneurship and women's rise in Japan.
And Atsuko, is there a question you have for Janice in that regard?
Yes, Janice, I'm wondering if you're going to do some book signing events or something like that in Tokyo, because I would like to let Alumni Association know about.
I would be very interested in it. I have no plans right now, but I certainly would be very open to the possibility. Most definitely. There's always, my husband's family is there. We are back and forth quite a bit, and I would love the chance to discuss this story with people in Japan. Definitely.
Okay, great. More networking. All right, let's go to another question. Thank you, Atsuko, for participating and for your observation as well. Next question.
Hi, yes, this is Jennifer Butler from Jackson, Mississippi. I ordered the book, and it arrived in time for me to be able to finish it just today.
Wonderful.
And it was amazing. I was very moved by it, and I was wondering a little bit about how you were able to find all of the correspondence between the Stematu and Ume and Alice, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your process of getting that translated and how you decided what you would include, and a little bit on that side.
Right. Well, the great gift of this story was these girls grew up in America, and the language of their emotional life was English, so that when they wrote back to their foster families or to each other, they wrote in English. There were letters at Vassar, there was some at Yale, there was some at Rutgers University in New Jersey, which has a long history with Japanese students way back, even before 1868. And of course, there was a treasure trove at Tsuda College. Other than that, what I was going on, aside from letters, was a lot of newspapers. Newspapers covered every step the Iwakura mission took. They covered, notable achievements in the girls' lives while they were growing up here. And then, once they were back during the period of the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars. There was a lot of great coverage to draw from.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer, for your question.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, from Jackson, Mississippi, where are we going next?
I have a question from San Francisco. If that's
Great.
okay.
All right, and who are you?
My name is Tasha Yorozu, and I'm calling from San Francisco. Hi. So I just got the book, and I'm on chapter 3, so I can't say I've read the whole thing, but I've read a couple of the reviews as well, and your explanation today was really helpful. I'm a graduate of Bryn Mawr College, so I am very, very fascinated by this whole story. There are aspects that I didn't know about and that are just coming to light through your book. But my question is twofold. The first one is, how long did it take you to write this book? Because, Abenomics, the third arrow, and the promotion of the status of women is a hot issue now. But I'm wondering if you started writing this book even before it became a hot issue. And I'm just wondering about how long did it take to write the book?
I stumbled across Alice's book and became aware of the story probably 10 years ago. I started writing the book in earnest 5 years ago, I would say.
Okay.
So no, I got lucky with with all of the coverage of womenomics going on now, but it definitely
right.
There was no ulterior motive there.
Oh, right. But the language you use in chapter 3 about the education of women and how they were selected and the perception of, what Kuroda saw in Western women, that is so current, and so it's a book that's talking about a story 100 years ago, but the observations were so current and the issues seem to be so current. So I just feel like the timing is perfect. That this book was meant to happen.
It's amazing how there's a sense of globalization back then. We talk about globalization now, but isn't there? When you read this book,
that was one of the biggest surprises for me is we tend to think in 2015 that we have the lock on globalization, that we invented it. Right down to the families that took these girls in. When you think about the open-mindedness it takes to accept a child from across the planet into your home for 10 years, there are very few people I know in New York City today who would consider that.
So it's a fantastic, it was a meant to be book, it seems like. And then my second question is, back in the day, so when this, the time of when you discuss in the book, there were no words such as, Japanese American or globalization or, these various names and labels that we give to people. But, in what you just said a few minutes ago, you said, all these 3 women, although they went back to Japan, they found their place or they found their, purpose. And those who had already found their purpose were living their purpose, all of them in Japan. But you did say that none of them were quite comfortable, regardless of where they were located. Because what I'm assuming what you meant by that is that once you get a taste of something that you knew nothing about, in their case, the Western culture, And once you start to have that strong sense of self, which in their case is a combination of what they learned in the East and what they learned in the West, and then a combination of all of that. My question is this, once you become like that, like they were, then yes, I'm assuming they were uncomfortable wherever they were because there is no label to put on them, you know. What's your thought there on, you know, women today where now we do have labels, you know, globalization, Japanese American, Kibe, whatever the label is, there are these labels, but the people themselves probably are still as uncomfortable or as searching for a place to belong, and then in the end, maybe coming to the conclusion that, you know, there is no label to describe, you know, those type of people, and that's our norm. And what's your thought on that?
Yeah. They were the first Kibe in a way, right? And another, it was another reason that the story really resonated with me, because my husband came here with his family when he was 3 years old for what was supposed to be 2 years, and then stretched to 13. He spent 1 year of grade school back in Tokyo and felt very much that discomfort. With these women, the poignance was really that they reached heights of intellectual and physical freedom as young women in America that they never were able to match back in Japan. There's a very poignant quote from Sematsu as an older woman in her 50s saying, you know, in Japan when we women are old, we don't laugh very much. This was, you know, in response to Vassar classmates coming to visit her as middle-aged women to pay a call on the Princess Oyama. I think there's something universal about straddling two cultures and losing the ability to feel totally at home. These women were you know, they were home, they were back in Japan, but they were homesick really for the rest of their lives. Not yearning to return because they knew that returning was not an option, but just yearning. And the bonds that they made were almost always with people who had shared that experience of straddling. Oyama himself had spent significant amount of time in France and in Switzerland, and Oyama and Sematsu had a very happy marriage, partly because I think they shared this changeling feeling of being Japanese and being fiercely proud of that, but also being something else too, that the people around them didn't entirely grasp. They struggled also with the perception of their peers. You know, Umetsuda is a hero today, but in her moment, especially when she was founding the school, there were plenty of people who found her suspicious or off-putting. Sematsu the same. There was a very popular sort of romana clay, sort of tell-all novel published in the 1890s that was sort of a tell-all about Sematsu's family. She had one of the daughters died of tuberculosis and had a tortured love affair, and the book was their love story, and it was very sympathetic, except to Sematsu, who was portrayed as this sort of evil stepmother who was so westernized that she couldn't understand her own family. That was how they were seen by their peers in their moment. I think, you know, their public perception today has sort of, you know, restored them to restore the respect that they deserved, having accomplished what they did. But it was not easy. The feeling that they had come back accomplished and had something to share was not something that everybody recognized right off the bat.
All right, let's go. Time now probably for about 2 more questions. All right, we went to the West Coast. And we went from some other city.
Hello, this is Amy Guggenheim.
Hello, Amy.
Hi. Fascinating discussion.
Tell us who you are. Tell us who you are and where you're calling from.
I'm calling from New York City. I'm a filmmaker. I'm making a film about Japanese and American relationship and kendo, Japanese sword fighting. So, of course, reading about the early age of Bushido and the values of Bushido and the samurai was very interesting, and to see how there's so much carried over today in the world of Kendo. But my question is, and also that the story itself was so cinematic, I could really see it unfolding in front of me, of the life that was before and then the life that was present. Right. And my question is related to what you were just talking about, that in some sense I felt like it was about Japan and about coming to America, but it was really a story about what you say at the end of the very last line of the book, of home is where you are, and this idea of that we're always adapting to culture, and we're adapting to change, whether it's like historical change or cultural change or living in another place. And what you had mentioned earlier about, you know, it's a division or a balancing between what we give up and what we hold on to, what we take on that's new. So my question specifically is what you felt was what the women individually held on to from being samurai, from being the daughters of samurai.
Right. I mean, if you've read the prologue of the book, which the book opens with the scene in which the 5 little girls, because there were 5 at the beginning, are invited for an audience with the Empress, which is in itself earth-shaking. The Empress has never met with people outside of the court, let alone little girls. And she meets with them in order to bestow upon them the mandate to study abroad. It's hard to overstate how awe-inspiringly striking that would have been to 5 little girls. And they, you know, these were girls who had grown up in samurai households with discipline and obedience and loyalty being the paramount pillars of their lives. When the Empress, she was invisible to them, she was behind a screen, but when her lady-in-waiting reads the words of the mandate to them, they become engraved on their hearts and minds. There is no way they are going to say, you know, I think I'd rather stay in America, actually. They have a mission to fulfill, and they carry it with them until they die. That, to me, they remain daughters of the samurai in that way from beginning to end. There is no...
That each of them individually integrated aspects of the samurai in their lives differently, in addition to what you just said?
I think they all did it in rather a similar way. I think they just all had a very elevated sense of their duty, duty to their country, and then, you know, more domestically, their duty to their families, or in Ume's case, her school, which became her family. They were unswerving. They may have had their off days, but they never really deviated from this through line of commitment to a cause, even though the cause that had launched them to America was sort of lost sight of by the Japanese government. I don't think anybody was really waiting for them when they got back. But they knew what they needed to do, and they did it.
And they carried the ball from that point. They didn't just let it die. They said, this is what we're going to do. And I think what we're going to do is take one more question. So last one up. Who's the last batter up? Don't all hit the button at once.
Hello?
All right. A male minority from the audience.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Frederick from San Diego. Yes, thank you so much. That was, I scrambled to read the book. I got a little over halfway through, but the language itself is very, very rich and descriptive. And I enjoyed reading it as an art form in itself. It brings to life the...
Frederick was a former intern at USJC, U.S. Japan Council, by the way, Janet.
Yes,
so what's your question, Frederick, from San Diego?
Yes. Yes, well, I wanted to know in what ways, as much as the focus is on Japan, how can this be conceived as an American story?
Well, that's a great question. Keeping in mind that the decade that the girls were in America was the 1870s, and 1876 was the American centennial. In fact, that picture of the 3 of them that's on the jacket was taken when they converged in Philadelphia on their summer vacation to visit the American Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. They toured the Japanese pavilion in their Western dresses. this was a moment of pivot for America. The American Centennial was this moment where America, with great satisfaction, was pivoting from being an upstart nation, the rebel nation trying to prove itself to the old world, pivoting to being the mentor nation. All of a sudden, here's Japan saying, show us, teach us, tell us how to be as great as you are. We are here to learn from you. That's very heady when you're America. You've suddenly made it. You're suddenly a leader rather than struggling to establish yourself. And this is very much a story of that as well. I think one of the titles that was discarded for the book was The Girls from the Land of the Gods. And on one level, that's girls from Japan, the land of the gods. But on another, it's also girls coming back to Japan from America, because to Japan, America was sort of the land of the gods. It was the land of the titans of industry that they wanted to emulate. So it really is an American story as well in that regard.
And as for the title, Janice, I might tell you that when I mentioned on Facebook today that I was prepping for this event, a former colleague of mine who I used to work with at Fortune magazine said, were they really the daughters of actual samurai? And I said, no, they really were. This is the time when the samurai, the feudal, was in Japan and was gone, but in came the guys cutting off the top knots and putting on Western suits, and these girls raced out in that Japan's drive for modernization and to catch up and learn from the West. And I think we learned a lot from you today. Thank you for spending this precious hour of your time with us. I know you're on this barnstorming on this nationwide tour, and maybe now, through the U.S.-Japan people-to-people connection of the U.S.-Japan Council, you'll make your way over to Tsuda College as well, and maybe over to Bryn Mawr, because you found that. All we need to find you next time is a Vassar alum from our organization.
That's right.
I'm sure there is one, right?
I will be in San Francisco and Portland this weekend into Tuesday. So if you're in that region, please go to my website and maybe I'll get to meet you.
And you can follow her on Twitter as well, at Janice Nimura. So I want to say thank you to Janice for joining us. Best luck on her book, although she doesn't need it anymore. It's taken off. I also want to say thanks to Shiori Okazaki, who our communications manager at the U.S.-Japan Council, who painstakingly helped put this together, looked into the infrastructure, and helped set it up with the guidance, as always, of Suzanne Bassanla, our Executive Vice President and COO. And please let us know via email. You can email Shiori, or you can tweet me. Let us know what you think about this event, how we might make it better, and what other type of speakers you'd like to listen to, and what kind of themes you'd like us to tackle. This was a first for us. And finally, don't forget our next annual conference will be in Japan in November 9th through 10th. So hope to see many of you there. Thanks again for joining us. Good day, everyone.